Well, hello everybody. Good evening. Happy Tuesday to you all. Well, because it's Tuesday, that means we're here for another story time. Last week we finished up the Hammer of the Sun. So we finished the trilogy of the Winter of the World. We found out that Elof was actually Ilmarinen, one of the ancient powers that had decided to take on human form and kind of immerse himself in that way. So the trilogy is finished. It's all up on my YouTube channel if you want to listen to anything that you may have missed. The Anvil of Ice, the Forge in the Forest, the Hammer of the Sun. All available out there for you to listen to. And of course, the books are available out there as well. You watched me as I read them all on my Kindle. And if you wanted to support the author, by all means, get out there and get the books. I'm sure, the author at this point has passed away, but I'm sure his estate, the publishers, whomever is in control of any of that right now, would appreciate anything that you sent their way. And of course, if you want me to be able to continue to do these and things like that, I love to have your continued support as well. I don't have to have it, but it's always nice. You guys just being here with me is enough for me. Now, as promised, we are moving on to, you see it over here on the right-hand side, A Spell for Chameleon. Now, I'm going a little bit differently with this one. As you can see, my screen is a little bit differently here. I've got my, Sir Arminius background here. I'm actually on webcam again because now that I have my gimbal webcam, I can move around. The camera will move around with me, so I can actually, juke and jive during the thing. I can stand up and continue to read, moving my mic along with me so that way you guys continue to hear me. And I can actually get up and move while I'm doing the reading, which is important to me because it's important that I can get up and move around and just, continue to stay comfortable as the evening moves along and as we do our readings. And with that, I am not going to be putting the text of the book up there. I have the cover up of the book over to the right-hand side. If you wanted to get the book to be able to read along or anything like that, I picked it up on Kindle, I don't know, 2 days ago. You can certainly do the same, or you can listen along as I do my readings of any of this as well. Completely up to you as to which way you'd like to go. Now, I know mine aren't the only readings out there, that'll be available on YouTube for, some of the, Xant series. I know A Spell for Chameleon, when I was searching for it, there's a couple of, versions out there on YouTube. I haven't listened to them. I don't know if they're any good. Could be people just like me doing it. Could be something. But I know the audiobook itself is not available on, Audible. It's not available for purchase. Those are the books that I'm trying to do for you guys to make sure that we're providing you guys with kind of quality content to be able to have, and things that you can't necessarily pick up to be able to listen to otherwise. Um, Again, I am certain that the author would love to have your support if you you know like these, wanted to pick up any of the books, anything like that. I have no doubt they would love to sell you some of the books. So make sure that you're supporting your local bookstores, your authors. If you do them digitally like I do, through Amazon, through wherever else, that you get what you need to do. But with that, we'll start into book number 1 of the Xanth novels, A Spell for Chameleon by Piers Anthony. Came out 1977, I want to say. So, I mean, the book is maybe a little bit dated in some of it, but it is what it is. It's a decent book. It's punny. I like a good punny book. And hopefully, if you guys haven't listened to it before, you'll enjoy it. If you have, maybe it'll be nice and nostalgic for you. But go ahead and sit back, everybody, relax, and prepare to enjoy as we move into our readings for this Tuesday. Chapter 1, Xanth. A small lizard perched on a brown stone. Feeling threatened by the approach of human beings along the path, it metamorphosized into a stingray beetle, then into a stench puffer, then into a fiery salamander. Bink smiled. These conversions weren't real. It had assumed the forms of obnoxious little monsters, but not their essence. It could not sting, stink, or burn. It was a chameleon, using its magic to mimic creatures of genuine threat. Yet as it shifted into the form of a basilisk, it glared at him with such ferocity that Bink's mirth abated. If its malice could strike him, he would be horribly dead. Then abruptly, a silent moth hawk swooped down from the sky and caught the chameleon in its beak. There was a thin scream of anguish as the lizard convulsed. Then it dangled limply as the hawk ascended. The chameleon, despite all its pretensions, was dead. Even while trying to threaten Bink, it had been destroyed by another agency. This realization continued to percolate through Bink's emotion. The chameleon was harmless, but most of untamed Xanth was not. Was this some twisted omen? A small suggestion of a dire fate awaiting him? Omens were serious business. They always came true, but usually were misinterpreted until too late. Was Bink fated to die brutally? Or was some enemy of his? He had, so far as he knew, no enemies. The golden sun of Xanth shone through the magic shield, striking sparkles from the trees. All plants had their enchantments, but no spell could eliminate the need for light, water, and healthy soil. Instead, magic was used to make these necessities of the vegetable kingdom more available, and to protect the plants from destruction, unless they were overpowered by stronger magic, or simple bad luck, like the chameleon. Bink looked at the girl beside him as she stepped through a slanting sunbeam. He was no plant, but he too had needs, and even the most casual inspection of her made him aware of this. Sabrina was absolutely beautiful, and her beauty was completely natural. Other girls managed to enhance their appearance by cosmetics or padding or specialized spells. But besides Sabrina, all other females looked somewhat artificial. She was no enemy. They came to Lookout Rock. This was not a particularly lofty promontory, but its situational magic made it seem more elevated than it was, so that they could look down on a quarter slice of Xanth. This was a land of multicolored vegetation, small pretty lakes, and deceptively quiet fields of flowers, ferns, and crops. Even as Bink watched, one of the lakes expanded slightly, making itself seem cooler and deeper, a better place for a swim. Bink wondered briefly about this, as he often did. He had an unruly mind, which constantly pestered him with questions for which there were no ready answers. As a child, he had driven parents and friends almost to distraction with his, "Why is the sun yellow? Why do ogres crunch bones? Why can't sea monsters cast spells?" and similarly infantile prattle. No wonder he had soon been hustled away to centaur school. Now he had learned to control his mouth, but not his brain, and so he let it run on in silence. Animate spells he could understand, such as those of the unfortunate Chameleon. They facilitated comfort, survival, or image for living creatures. But why should inanimate things have magic? Did a lake care who swam in it? Well, maybe so. A lake was an ecological unit, and the community of living things within it might have a mutual interest in promoting it. Or a freshwater dragon might be responsible, luring in prey. Dragons were the most varied and dangerous life forms on Xanth. Species occupied air, earth, and water, and a number breathed fire. One thing they all had in common: good appetite. Pure chance might not bring in enough fresh meat. But what about Lookout Rock? It was bare, without even lichen, and hardly beautiful. Why should it want company? And if it did, why not make itself more handsome instead of remaining gray and drab? People did not come here to admire the rock, but to admire the rest of Xanth. Such a spell seemed self-defeating. Then Bink stubbed his toe on a sharp fragment of stone. He was standing on a cracked rock terrace, formed generations ago by the breaking up of a pretty colored boulder, and there it was. That other boulder, which must have been close to Lookout Rock and of similar size, had been fragmented to make this path and terrace, losing its identity. Lookout Rock had survived. Nobody would break it up, because it would make an ugly path, and its unselfish magic made it useful as it stood. One minor mystery solved. Still, there were philosophical considerations, his insatiable mind insisted. How could an inanimate thing think or have feelings? What was survival to a rock? A boulder was merely the fragment of a prior layer of rock. Why should it have a personal identity if the bedrock didn't? Still, the same question could be asked of a man. He had been formed from the tissues of the plants and animals he consumed, yet he had a separate— "What did you wish to talk to me about, Bink?" Sabrina inquired demurely. As if she didn't know. But as his mind formed the necessary words, his mouth balked. He knew what her answer had to be. No one could remain in Xanth after his 25th birthday unless he demonstrated a magic talent. Bink's own critical birthday was barely a month away. There was no child now. How could she marry a man who was so soon to be exiled? Why hadn't he thought of that before bringing her out here? He could only embarrass himself. Now he had to say something to her, or suffer further embarrassment, making it awkward for her as well. I just wanted to see your. See my what? She inquired with an arch lift of an eyebrow. He felt the heat starting up his neck. Your holograph, he blurted. There was much more of her he longed to see, and to touch, but that could come only after marriage. She was that sort of girl, and it was part of her appeal. The girls who had it didn't need to put it on casual display. Well, not quite true. He thought of Aurora, who certainly had it, yet who. Bink, there is a way, Sabrina said. He glanced sidelong at her, then quickly away, confused. She couldn't be suggesting. The good magician Humphrey, she continued blithely. What? He had been on quite a different track. No credit to his willful mind. Humphrey knows 100 spells. Maybe one of them. I'm sure he could find out what your talent is. Then everything would be all right. Oh. But he charges a year's service for a single spell, Bink protested. I have only a month. But that was not quite accurate. If the magician identified a talent for Bink, then he would not be exiled, and he would have a year available. He was deeply touched by Sabrina's faith in him. She did not say what others said, that he had no magic. She did him the immense courtesy of choosing to believe that his magic merely remained undiscovered. Perhaps it was that faith that had first attracted him to her. Certainly she was beautiful and intelligent and talented, a prize by any definition. But she could have been much less in all categories, still been his. A year is not so long, Sabrina murmured. I would wait. Bink stared down at his hands, pondering. His right hand was normal, but he had lost the middle finger of his left hand in a childhood accident. It had not even been the result of inimical magic. He had been playing with a cleaver, holding down a stalk of coil grass while he chopped, pretending it was the tail of a dragon. After all, a boy could not start to practice too early for the serious side of life. The grass had twitched out of his grip as he swung, and he had grabbed for it, and the cleaver had come down hard on his extended finger. It had hurt, but the worst of it was that because he was not supposed to play with the cleaver, he had not dared scream or tell of his injury. He had controlled himself with extreme effort and suffered in silence. He had buried the finger and managed to hide his mutilation by keeping his hand closed for several days. When the truth finally came out, it was too late for a restorative spell. The finger was rotted and could not be reattached. A strong enough spell could have attached it, but it would have remained a zombie finger. He had not been punished. His mother, Bianca, believed he had learned his lesson, and he had. He had. Next time he played with a cleaver on the sly, he would watch where his fingers were. His father seemed privately pleased that Bink had shown so much courage and tenacity in adversity, even in his wrongdoing. The lad's got nerve, Roland had said. Now, if only he had magic. Bink jerked his eyes away from the hand. That had been 15 years ago. Suddenly, a year seemed short indeed. 1 year of service in exchange for a lifetime with Sabrina. It was a bargain. Yet, suppose he had no magic. Was he to pay a year of his life to verify the certainty of being thrust into the drear realm of the null-talented? Or would it be better to accept exile, preserving the useless hope that he did have a latent talent? Sabrina, respecting his flurry of contemplation, began her holograph. A haze of blue appeared before her, hanging over the slope. It expanded, thinning at the edges, intensifying in the center, until it was 2 feet in diameter. It looked like thick smoke, but did not dissipate or drift. Now she began to hum. She had a good voice, not a great one, but right for her magic. At the sound, the blue cloud quivered and solidified, becoming roughly spherical. Then she changed her pitch, and the outer rim turned yellow. She opened her mouth, singing the word girl, and the colors assumed the shape of a young lass in a blue dress with yellow frills. The figure was three-dimensional, visible from all sides with differing perspective. It was a fine talent. Sabrina could sculpt anything. But the images vanished the moment her concentration stopped, and never had any physical substance. So this was, strictly speaking, useless magic. It did not improve her life in any material fashion. Yet, how many talents really did help their people? One person could make a leaf of a tree wither and die as he looked at it. Another could create the odor of sour milk. Another could make insane laughter bubble up from the ground. These were all magic, no question about it. But what use were they? Why should such people qualify as citizens of Xanth while Bink, who was smart, strong, and handsome, was disqualified? Yet that was the absolute rule. No non-magical person could remain beyond his quarter-century mark. Sabrina was right. He had to identify his talent. He had never been able to find it on his own, so he should pay the good magician's price. Not only would this preserve him from exile, which really would be a fate worse than death, since what was the point in life without magic, and win him Sabrina, a fate considerably better than death, it would also redeem his battered self-respect. He had no choice. "Oh!" Sabrina exclaimed, clapping her hands to her pert derriere. The holograph dissolved, the blue-dressed girl distorting grotesquely before she vanished. "I'm on fire!" Bink stepped toward her, alarmed. But even as he moved, there was loud juvenile laughter. Sabrina whirled furiously. "Numbo, you stop that!" she cried. She was one of those girls who was as appealing in anger as in joy. "It's not funny." It was, of course, Numbo, who had given her a magical hot seat, a fiery pain in the posterior. Talk about a useless talent. Bink, his fists clenched so tightly that his thumb jammed into the stub of his missing finger, strode toward the grinning youth standing behind Lookout Rock. Numbo was 15, cocky and annoying. He needed a lesson. But Bink's foot struck a loose rock, which turned his ankle long enough to cost him his balance. It didn't hurt, but it interrupted his forward progress. His hand swung forward, and his fingers touched an invisible wall. There was another shout of laughter. Bink hadn't crashed headlong into the wall, thanks to the providential stone under his foot, but evidently someone thought he had. "You too, Chilk," Sabrina said. That was Chilk's talent, the wall. It was a kind of compliment to Sabrina's talent. Instead of being visible without substance, it had substance without visibility. It was only 6 feet square, and, like so many talents, it was strictly temporary. But it was hard as steel in the first few moments. Bing could dodge around it and run the kid down, but he was sure to get caught several times by that re-manifesting wall, and suffer more damage than he could do to the boy. It wasn't worth it. If only he had a talent of his own, such as Numbo's hot seat, he could make the Joker sorry regardless of the wall. But he didn't, and Chilk knew it. Everyone knew it. That was Bink's big problem. He was fair game for all the pranksters, because he couldn't strike back. Not magically, and it was deemed crass to do it physically. Right now, he was quite ready to be crass, however. "Let's get out of here, Bink," Sabrina said. There was disgust in her voice, nominally directed at the intruders, but Bink suspected part of it applied to him. An impotent kind of rage began building up, one he had felt many times before, and had never gotten used to. He had been balked from proposing to her by the lack of a talent, and he could not stay here, for the same reason. Not here at Lookout Rock, or here in Xanth, because he didn't fit in. They walked back down the path. The Jokers, getting no further rise from their prey, went in search of other mischief. The landscape no longer seemed so lovely. Maybe he'd be better off away from here. Maybe he should take off now, not waiting to be officially exiled. If Sabrina really loved him, she'd come with him, even outside, into Mundania. No, he knew better than that. Sabrina loved him, but she loved Xanth too. She had such a sweet shape, such kissable lips, that she could find another man much more easily than she could adjust to the rigors of life among the non-magical. For that matter, he could find another girl more easily than what he faced. So probably, objectively, he'd be better off going alone. So why didn't his heart agree? They passed the brown stone where the chameleon had perched, and he shuddered. "Why don't you ask Justin?" Sabrina suggested as they approached the village. It was dusk, closing in faster here than up at Lookout Rock. The village lamps were coming on. Bink glanced across at the unique tree she indicated. There were many kinds of trees in Xanth, a number of them vital to the economy. Beer barrel trees were tapped for drink, and oil barrel trees for fuel. And Bink's own footwear came from a mature shoe tree east of the village. But Justin Tree was something special, a species never sprouted from seed. Its leaves were shaped like flat hands, and its trunk was the hue of tanned human flesh. This was scarcely surprising, since it had once been human. In an instant that history flashed across Bink's mind, part of the dynamic folklore of Xanth. 20 years earlier, there'd been one of the greatest of the evil magicians, a young man named Trent. He had possessed the power of transformation, the ability to change any living thing into any other living thing instantly. Not satisfied with his status of magician, granted in recognition of the awesome strength of his magic, Trent had sought to use his power to preempt the throne of Xanth. His procedure had been simple and most direct. He transformed anyone who opposed him into something that could not oppose him. The worst threats he converted to fish on dry land, allowing them to flop until they died. The mere nuisances he changed to animals or plants. Thus, several intelligent animals owed their status to him, though they were dragons, two-headed wolves, and land octopi. They retained the intelligence and perspective of their human origins. Trent was gone now, but his works remained, for there was no other transformer to change them back. Holographs, hot seats, and invisible walls were qualifying talents, but transformation was of a different order. Only once in a generation did such power manifest in an individual, and it seldom manifested twice in the same form. Justin had been one of Magician Trent's annoyances. No one remembered exactly what he had done, so Justin was a tree. No one had the ability to change him back into a man. Justin's own talent had been voice projection, not the parlor trick that was ventriloquism, or the trivial talent of insane laughter, but genuine, comprehensible utterance at a distance without the use of vocal cords. He retained this talent as a tree, and as he had a great deal of time for thought, villagers often came to this tree for advice. Often it was good advice. Justin was no genius, but a tree had greater objectivity about human problems. It occurred to Bink that Justin might actually be better off as a tree than he had been as a man. He liked people, but it was said that in his human form he had not been handsome. As a tree, he was quite stately, and no threat to anyone. They veered to approach Justin. Suddenly a voice spoke directly in front of them. "Do not approach, friends. Ruffians are lurking." Bink and Sabrina drew up short. "Is that you, Justin?" she asked. "Who is lurking?" But the tree could not hear as well as it could speak, and did not answer. Wood did not seem to make the best ears. Bink, angry, took a step toward it. "Justin is public scenery," he muttered. "Nobody has a right to." "Please, Bink," Sabrina urged, pulling back on his arm. "We don't want any trouble." No, she never wanted any trouble. He would not go so far as to call this a fault in her, but at times it became annoyingly inconvenient. Bink himself never let trouble bar him from a matter of principle. Still, Sabrina was beautiful, and he had caused her trouble enough already tonight. He turned to accompany her away from the tree. "Hey, no fair!" a voice exclaimed. "They're going away!" "Justin must have tattled!" another cried. "Then let's chop down Justin!" Bink halted again. "They wouldn't," he said. "Of course they wouldn't," Sabrina agreed. "Justin is a village monument. Ignore them." But the voice of the tree came again, a bit misplaced in relation to Bink and Sabrina, evidence of poor concentration. "Friends, please fetch the king quickly. These ruffians have an axe or something, and they've been eating loco berries." "An axe?" Sabrina exclaimed in sheer horror. king is out of town, Bink muttered. Anyway, he's senile. And he hasn't summoned more than a summer shower in years, Sabrina agreed. Kids didn't dare make so much mischief when he had his full magic. We certainly didn't, Bink said. Remember the hurricane flanked by 6 tornadoes he summoned to put down the last wiggle spawning? He was a real Storm King then. There was the ringing sound of metal biting into wood. A scream of sheer agony erupted from the air. Bink and Sabrina jumped. That's Justin, she said. They're doing it. No time for the king anyway, Bink said. He charged toward the tree. Bink, you can't, Sabrina cried after him. You don't have any magic. So the truth came out in this moment of crisis. She didn't really believe he had a talent. I've got muscle, though, he yelled back. You go for help. Justin screamed again as the blade struck a second time. It was an eerie wooden noise. There was laughter, the merry mirth of kids out on a lark, having no care at all what consequences their actions might have. Loco? This was mere insensitivity. Then Bink was there, and he was alone. Just when he was in the mood for a good fight, the malicious pranksters had scattered. He could guess their identities, but he didn't have to. Jama, Zinc, and Portifer, Justin Therese said. Ooh, my foot! Bink squatted to inspect the cut. The white wood wound was clearly visible in contrast to the shoe-like bark of the base of the tree trunk. Driblets of reddish sap were forming, very much like blood. Not too serious for a tree this size, but surely extremely uncomfortable. I'll get some compresses for that, Bink said. There's some coral sponge in the forest near here. Yell if anyone bothers you while I'm gone. I will, Justin said. Hurry. Then, as an afterthought, you're a great guy, Bink. Much better than some who... Than some who have magic, Bink finished for him. Thanks for trying to spare my feelings. Justin meant well, but sometimes spoke before he thought. It came from having a wooden brain. It isn't fair that louts like Jama are citizens, will you? Thanks, Bink said gruffly, moving off. He agreed completely, but what was the use talking about it? He watched out for anyone lurking in the bushes, waiting to bother Justin when the tree was unprotected, but saw nobody. They were really gone. Jama, Zinc, and Portifer, he thought darkly, the village troublemakers. Jama's talent was a manifestation of a sword, and that was what had chopped Justin's trunk. Anyone who could imagine that such vandalism was funny. Bink remembered one of his own bitter experiences with that bunch, not so many years ago. Intoxicated by loco berries, the three had lurked in ambush along one of the paths beyond the village, just looking for mischief. Bink and a friend had walked into that trap, and been backed up against the cloud of poison gas that was Portifer's magic talent, while Zinc made mirage holes near their feet, and Jama materialized flying swords for them to duck. Some sport. Bink's friend had used his magic to escape, animating a golem from a stick of wood that took his place. The golem had resembled him exactly, so that it fooled the pranksters. Bink had known the difference, of course, but he had covered for his friend. Unfortunately, though the golem was immune to poison gas, Bink was not. He had inhaled some of it and lost consciousness even as help arrived. His friend had brought Bink's mother and father. Bink had found himself holding his breath again as the poison cloud enveloped him. He saw his mother tugging at his father's arm, pointing Bink's way. Bianca's talent was replay. She could jump time back 5 seconds in a small area. This was very limited, but deviously powerful magic, for it enabled her to correct a just-made mistake, such as Bink's breath of poison gas. Then his breath had whooshed out again, making Bianca's magic useless. She could keep replaying the scene indefinitely, but everything was replayed, including his breath. But Roland looked piercingly, and Bink had frozen. Roland's talent was the stun gaze. One special glance, and what he looked at was frozen in place, alive but immobile until released. In this manner, Bink had been prevented from breathing the gas a second time, until his rigid body had been carried out. As the stun abated, he had found himself in his mother's arms. "Oh, my baby!" she cried, cradling his head against her bosom. "Did they hurt you?" Bink came to an abrupt stop by the bed of sponge, his face flushing even now with the keen embarrassment of that memory. Had she had to do that? Certainly she had saved him from an early death, but he had been the laughingstock of the village for an interminable time after. Everywhere he went, kids exclaimed, "My baby!" in falsetto and sniggered. He had his life at the expense of his pride, yet he knew he could not blame his parents. He had blamed Chama and Zinc and Portifer. Bink had no magic, but perhaps for that reason, he was the huskiest boy in the village. He had had to fight as long as he could remember. He was not especially well coordinated, but he had a lot of raw power. He'd gone after Jama privately and demonstrated convincingly that the fist was swifter than the magic sword. Then Zinc, and finally Portifer. Bink had hurled him into his own gas cloud, forcing him to dissolve it very suddenly. Those three had not sniggered at Bink thereafter. In fact, they tended to avoid him, which was why they had scattered when he charged the tree. Together, they could have overcome him, but they had been well conditioned by those separate encounters. Bink smiled, his embarrassment replaced by grim pleasure. Perhaps his manner of dealing with the situation had been immature, but there had been a lot of satisfaction in it. Down underneath, he knew it had been his irritation at his mother that motivated him, displaced to people like Jama, but he did not regret it. He did love his mother, after all. But in the end, his only chance to redeem himself had been to find his own magic talent, a good, strong one like that of his father, Roland. So no one would dare to tease him or laugh at him or baby him ever again. So that pure shame would not drive him from Xanth. That had never happened. He was known contemptuously as the Spellless Wonder. He stooped to gather several good, strong sponges. These would abate Justin Tree's discomfort, for that was their magic. They absorbed agony and spread a healing comfort. A number of plants and animals, he was not quite sure in which category the sponges fit, had similar properties. The advantage of the sponges was that they were mobile. Plucking them would not kill them. They were tough. They had migrated from the water when the corals did, and now thrived on land. Probably their magic healing properties had been developed to facilitate their lives in the new medium. Or maybe before the migration, since coral was cutting stuff. Talents tended to run in schools, with one overlapping another. Thus, many variants of each type of magic showed up in the plant and animal kingdoms. But among people, magic varied extremely widely. It seemed that individual personality had more to do with it than heredity, though the strongest magic tended to turn up in particular family lines. As if strength of magic was hereditary, well, type of magic was environmental. Yet there were other factors. Bink could fit a lot of reflection into a passing moment. If reflection were magic, he'd be a magician. But right now, he'd better concentrate on what he was doing, or he'd be in trouble. Dusk was intensifying. Dismal shapes were rising out of the forest, hovering as if seeking prey. Eyeless and formless, they nevertheless conducted themselves with a disquieting awareness, orienting on Bink, or seeming to. More magic was unexplained than was safely catalogued. A will-o'-the-wisp caught Bink's nervous eye. He started to follow the half-glimpsed light, then abruptly caught himself. The lure of the wisp was sheer mischief. It would lead him into the wilderness and lose him there, prey to the hostile magic of the unknown. One of Bink's childhood friends had followed the wisp and never returned. Warning enough. Night transformed Xanth. Regions like this one that were innocent by day became horrors as the sun sneaked down. Specters and shades came out, questing for their ghastly satisfactions. And occasionally a zombie ripped free of its grave and marched clumsily about. No sensible person slept outdoors, and every house in the village had repulsion spells against the supernatural. Bink did not dare use the shortcut back to Justin Tree. He would have to go the long way, following the looping but magically protected trails. This was not timidity, but necessity. He ran, not from fear, for there was no real danger on this charmed route, and he knew the paths too well to stray accidentally from them, but in order to reach Justin more swiftly. Justin's flesh was wood, but it hurt every bit as much as normal flesh. How anyone could be so crass as to chop at Justin Tree? Bink passed a field of sea oats, hearing the pleasant swish and gurgle of their oceanic tides. When harvested, they made excellent foamy broth, except that it tended to be rather salty. The bowls could only be filled halfway, otherwise the broth's continuing sea waves slopped over. He remembered the wild oats he had planted as an adolescent. Sea oats were restless, but their cousins, the wild oats, were hyperactive. They had fought him savagely, their stems slashing across his wrists as he tried to harvest a ripe ear. He had gotten it, but had been uncomfortably scratched and abraded before getting clear of the patch. He had planted those few wild seeds in a secret plot behind his house, and watered them every day, the natural way. He had guarded the bad-tempered shoots from all harm, his anticipation growing. What an adventure for a teen-aged male! Until his mother, Bianca, had discovered the plot. Alas, she had recognized the species instantly. There had been a prompt family hassle. "How could you?" Bianca demanded, her face flaming. But Roland had labored to suppress his admiring smile. "Sowing wild oats," he murmured. "The lad's growing up." "Now, Roland, you know that." "Dear, it isn't as if there's any real harm in it." "No harm!" she exclaimed indignantly. "It is a perfectly natural urge for a young man." But her furious expression had halted Bink's father, who feared nothing in Xanth but was normally a peaceable man. Roland sighed and turned to Bink. "I gather you do know what you were doing, son?" Bink felt excruciatingly defensive. "Well, yes. The nymph of the oats." "Bink!" Bianca snapped warningly. He had never seen her so angry before. Roland held up his hands, making peace. "Dear, why don't you let us work this out, man to man? The boy's got a right." And so Roland had betrayed his own bias. When his man-to-man chat was with Bink, it was with a boy. Without another word, Bianca had stalked out of the house. Roland turned to Bink, shaking his head in a gesture that was only nominally negative. Roland was a powerful, handsome man, and he had a special way with gestures. "Genuine wild oats, cold thrashing from the stem, sown by the full moon, watered with your own urine?" he inquired frankly, and Bink nodded, his face at half heat. "So that when the plants mature and the oat nymph manifests, she will be bound to you, the fertilizer figure?" Bink nodded grimly. "Son, believe me, I comprehend the attraction. I sowed wild oats myself when I was your age. Got me a nymph, too, with flowing green hair and a body like the great outdoors. But I had forgotten about the special watering, and so she escaped me. I never saw anything so lovely in my life. Except your mother, of course." Roland had sown wild oats? Bink had never imagined such a thing. He remained silent, afraid of what was coming. "I made the mistake of confessing about the oats to Bianca," Roland continued. "I fear she became somewhat sensitized on the subject, and you caught the brunt. These things happen." So his mother was jealous of something that had happened in his father's life before he married her. What a pitiful of concepts Bing had stumbled into, unwittingly. Roland's face became serious. "To a young man, inexperienced, the notion of a lovely, nude, captive nymph may be phenomenally tempting," he continued. "All the physical attributes of a real woman, and none of the mental ones. But, son, this is a juvenile dream, like finding a candy tree. The reality really would not be all you anticipated. One quickly becomes surfeited, tired of unlimited candy. And so it is also with a mindless female body. A man cannot love a nymph. She might as well be air. Her ardor rapidly turns to boredom and to disgust. Still, Bink dared not comment. He would not have become bored. He was sure. Roland understood him too well. Son, what you need is a real live girl, he concluded. A figure with a personality who will talk back to you. It is far more challenging to develop a relationship with a complete woman, and often equally frustrating. He glanced meaningfully at the door through which Bianca had departed. But in the long run, it is also far more rewarding. What you sought in the wild oats was a shortcut. But in life, there are no shortcuts. He smiled. Though if it had been up to me, I'd have let you try the shortcut. No harm in it. No harm at all. But your mother, well, we have a conservative culture here, and the ladies tend to be the most conservative, especially the pretty ones. It's a small village, smaller than it used to be, so everybody knows his neighbor's business. So we are circumscribed. Know what I mean? Bink nodded uncertainly. When his father laid down the law, however circumspectly, that was final. No more oats. Your mother, well, she was caught by surprise by your growing up. The oats are out. She's probably rooting them up right this instant. But you still have a lot of good experience ahead of you. Bianca might like to think of you as a little boy forever, but even she can't balk nature. Not for more than 5 seconds. So she'll simply have to go along with it. Roland paused, but Bink was silent again, unsure of what his father was leading up to. There's a girl due to move here from one of the lesser villages, Roland continued. Theoretically, this is for proper schooling, since we have the best centaur schoolmaster in Xanth. But I suspect the underlying reason is that there simply aren't many eligible boys in her village. I understand she has not yet discovered her magic talent, and she's about your age. He paused to glance meaningfully at Bink. I think she could use a handsome, healthy young man to show her around, warn her of local hazards. I understand she is extremely smart and pretty, and soft-spoken, a rare combination. Then Bink began to understand. A girl. A real girl for him to get to know. One who would not be prejudiced by his lack of magic. And Bianca would not be able to disapprove, though privately she might dislike the fact of Bink's newly masculine drives. His father had given him a viable option. Suddenly he realized he could do without wild oats. Her name is Sabrina, Roland said. A light ahead brought Bink back to the present. Someone was standing by Justin Tree, holding a magic lamp. It is all right, Bink, Justin's voice said in the air beside him. Sabrina brought help, but it wasn't needed. Did you get the sponge? I got it, Bink said. So his little adventure had been no adventure at all. Just like his life. As Sabrina helped him pack the sponge around Justin's wound, Bink realized that he had decided. He could not go on this way, a non-entity. He would go to see the good magician Humphrey and learn what his own magic talent was. He glanced up. His eyes caught those of Sabrina, glowing by the light of the lamp. He smiled. She was even more lovely now than she had been when he first met her, so many years ago, when they had both been adolescents, and she had always been true to him. There was no question. Bink's father had been correct about the advantages and frustrations of a real live girl. Now it was up to Bink to do what he had to do to become a real live man. All right, there is the end of chapter 1. So let me take a moment for a drink and wet the whistle, and then we'll start into chapter 2. All new book, much shorter chapters. Ain't it great? So for those of you guys who have been here through previous ones, you okay with this new format? Seeing me, book cover, my name up above. Oh, my arms, they're cut off. The camera that follows me around. Come on, the camera that follows me around. Why did the camera follow me around? Did the AI turn off again? Come on, AI tracking. You're supposed to be tracking me. Tracking me. Why isn't you tracking me? It's supposed to be tracking me. It's supposed to follow me. Why aren't you following me? Hello? Come on, camera. Come on. Follow me. I just want you to follow me. All to do is sing. Have an isky muse. Come on. Ooh. Hello, camera, my old friend. I'm taking breaks till I read again. Why will you not follow me? You're supposed to go and follow me. Dang program, do what you're supposed to do when you're here with me. Oh, what the he? Come on. These are off. They're supposed to be off. Did you stop tracking me, camera? I don't understand. You're supposed to do that on your own. But it doesn't want to. Oh, the silly new technologies. You gotta love them. Why are you having issues? Still a thing. Hey, Jeff. Good to see you. I mean, the camera's still clearly working, but it doesn't want to. It's not. It won't turn on the tracking. I know, right? Mean Arminius. Trying to make the camera do its job. Try, try this again. Will you recognize? I wonder if it's getting too warm in my office. That happens sometimes, I think. Or some of the technology stuff. So let's open some windows. And then we'll get into chapter 2, everyone. No, nothing's in front. Other than me. So let me try this for a second. Yeah. Try to put electrical tape on this. It was working earlier. I swear. Yes, walk softly and poke with a big stick. Uh, let me do this here. Probably the most simple of things that you can ever do to these things. Have you tried turning it off and on again? Because you guys know as well as I do, that tends to be what makes things work again. Oh, look, that's all it was. I unplugged it and plugged it back in. Have you tried turning it off and on again? The simplest things, you know, guys? Just the simplest things. There we go. Oh, okay. And we're back. Okay. Unplugged it, plugged it back in, and now we can get ourselves back into chapter 2 for A Spell for Chameleon. Again, I will post up all of the recordings for this on my YouTube channel after the stream tonight. Shorter chapters, much better. Yay! Happiness, joy. Um, if you guys do want to follow along, the book is available on Kindle. You could probably order it through your local bookseller, through Amazon, through all of those things, as ways to be able to get it as well. And I definitely want to give you guys a recommendation to support your local booksellers as well. I appreciate your support, and I'm sure they would as well. So let's go ahead and get into chapter 2. One more sip of the drink of champions, Dr. Pepper. It will zoom to the Dr. Pepper. Oh. Yes, the writing is backwards because, of course, they webcams reversed. That fun stuff. All right, guys. Chapter 2, Centaur. Bing set off on foot, wearing a stuffed knapsack and bearing a good hunting knife and a home-cut staff. His mother had urged him to let them hire a guide for him, but Bing had to refuse. The guide would really be a guard to keep him safe. How would he ever live that down? Yet the wilderness beyond the village had its hazards for the traveler unfamiliar with it. Few people hiked it alone. He really would have been better off with a guide. He could have had transport on a winged steed, but that would have been expensive and risky in its own fashion. Griffins were often surly creatures. He preferred to make his own way on the secure ground, if only to prove that he could, despite the fancied snickers of the village youths. Jama wasn't snickering much at the moment. He was laboring under the mortification spell the village elders had put on him for his attack on Justin Tree. But there were other snickerers. At least Roland had understood. One day, you'll discover that the opinions of worthless people are worthless, he had murmured to Bink. You have to do it your own way. And comprehend that, and wish you well. On your own. Bink had a map, and knew which path led to the castle of the good magician Humphrey. Rather, which path had led there. The truth was that Humphrey was a crotchety old man who preferred isolation in the wilderness. Periodically, he moved his castle, or changed the approaches to it by magical means, so that one never could be sure of finding it. Regardless, Bink intended to track the magician to his lair. The first leg of his journey was familiar. He had spent his whole life in the North Village, and explored most of its surrounding bypaths. Hardly any dangerous flora or fauna remained in the immediate vicinity, and those that were potential threats were well known. He stopped to drink at a water hole near a huge needle cactus. As he approached, the plant quivered, making ready to fire on him. "Hold, friend," Bink said commandingly. "I am of the North Village." The cactus, restrained by the pacification formula, withheld its deadly barrage. The key word was friend. The thing certainly was not a friend, but it had to obey the guise laid on it. No genuine stranger would know this, so the cactus was an effective guard against intruders. Animals below a certain size it ignored. Since most creatures had to have water sooner or later, this was a convenient compromise. Some areas had been ravaged occasionally by wild griffins and other large beasts, but not the North Village. One experience with an irate needler more than sufficed as a lesson for the animal lucky enough to survive it. Another hour's swift march brought him to less familiar territory. By definition, less safe. What did the people of this area use to guard their water holes? Unicorns trained to impale strangers? Well, he would find out soon enough. The rolling hills and small lakes gave way to rougher terrain, and strange plants appeared. Some had tall antennas that swiveled to orient on him from a distance. Others emitted subtly attractive crooning noises, but had branches bearing powerful pincers. Bink walked at a safe distance around them, taking no unnecessary risks. Once he thought he spied an animal about the size of a man, but it had 8 spider-like legs. He moved on rapidly and silently. He saw a number of birds, but these were of little concern. Since they could fly, they had little need for defensive magic against man, so he had no cause to be wary of them, unless he saw any big birds. Those might consider him prey. Once he spied the monstrous form of a rock in the distance, and cowered down, letting it wing on without seeing him. So long as the birds were small, he actually preferred their company, for the insects and bugs were, at times, aggressive. In fact, a cloud of gnats formed around his head, casting a mass sweat spell that made him even more uncomfortable. Insects had an uncanny ability to discern those with no magic for defense. Maybe they merely used trial and error, getting away with whatever they could. Bink looked about for bug-repellent weeds, but found none. Weeds were never where one wanted them. His temper was getting short as the sweat streamed down his nose and into his eyes and mouth. Then 2 little sucker saps swooped in, sucking up the gnats, and he had relief. Yes, he liked little birds. He made about 10 miles in 3 hours, and was tiring. He was in good condition generally, but was not used to sustained marching with a heavy pack. Every so often he got a twinge from the ankle he had turned at Lookout Rock. Not a bad twinge, for it turned out to be a minor hurt, just enough to keep him cautious. He sat on a hillock, first making sure it contained no itch ants, though it did have a needle cactus. He approached this very cautiously, uncertain as to whether it had been tamed by the spell. "Friend," he said, and just to make sure, he spilled a few drops of water from his canteen onto the soil for its roots to taste. Apparently, it was all right. It did not let fly at him. Even wild things often responded to common courtesy and respect. He broke out the lunch lovingly packed by his mother. He had food for 2 days, enough to get him to the magician's castle under ordinary circumstances. Not that things in Xanth were usually ordinary. He hoped to extend that by staying overnight with some friendly farmer. He would need food for the return trip, too, and in any event, did not relish the notion of sleeping outdoors. Night brought out special magic, and it could be ugly. He did not want to find himself arguing cases with a ghoul or ogre, since the case would most likely be the proper disposition of his human bones, whether they should be consumed live, while the marrow was fresh and sweet, or crunched after being allowed to age for a week after death. different predators had different tastes. He bit into the Cresmato sandwich. Something crunched, startling him, but it was not a bone, just a flavor stem. Bianca certainly knew how to make a sandwich. Roland always teased her about that, claiming she had mastered the art under the tutelage of an old sandwich. Yet it was unfunny to Bink, for it meant he was still dependent on her. Until he finished what she had prepared and foraged for himself. A crumb dropped and vanished. Bink looked around and spied a chip mouse chewing busily. It had conjured the crumb 10 feet, avoiding the risk of close approach. Bink smiled. I wouldn't hurt you, Chip. Then he heard something, the pounding of hooves. Some big animal was charging, or a mounted man approached. Either could mean trouble. Bink stuffed a chunk of wing cow cheese into his mouth, suffering a brief vision of the cow flying up to graze on the treetops after being relieved of her load of milk. He closed up his pack and shrugged his arms into the straps. He took his long staff in both hands. He might have to fight or run. The creature came into sight. It was a centaur, the body of a horse with the upper torso of a man. He was naked, in the manner of his kind, with muscular flanks, broad shoulders, and an ornery visage. Bink held his staff before him, ready for defense, but not aggressively so. He had little confidence in his ability to outfight the massive creature, and no hope of outrunning him. But maybe the centaur was not unfriendly, despite appearances, or did not know that Bink had no magic. The centaur pulled up close. He held his bow ready, an arrow nocked. He looked formidable indeed. Bink had developed a lot of respect for centaurs in school. This was obviously no elder sage, however, but a youthful brute. You are trespassing, the centaur said. Move off this range. Now wait, Bink said reasonably. I'm a traveler following the established path. It's a public right of way. Move off, the centaur repeated, his bow swinging around menacingly. Bink was normally a good-natured fellow, but he had a certain ornery streak that manifested in times of stress. This journey was vitally important to him. This was a public path, and he had had his fill of deterring to magical menaces. The centaur was a magical creature, having no existence in the mundane world beyond Xanth, by all accounts. Thus, Bink's aggravation against magic was stirred up again, and he did something foolish. Go soak your tail, he snapped. The centaur blinked. Now he looked even huskier, his shoulders broader, his chest deeper, his equine body even more dynamic than before. Obviously, he was not accustomed to such language, at least not directed at him, and the experience startled him. In due course, however, he made the requisite mental and emotional adjustments, signaled by an awe-inspiring nodding of oversized muscles. A deep red, almost purple wash of color ascended from the hairy horse base up through the bare stomach and scarred chest, accelerating and brightening as it funneled into the narrower neck and finally dyeing the head and ugly face explosively. As that inexorable tide of red rage ignited his ears and penetrated to his brain, the centaur acted. His bow swung about, the nocked arrow drawing back. As it bore on Bink, the arrow let fly. Naturally, Bink wasn't there. He had had ample opportunity to read the storm signals. As the bow moved, he ducked under. Then he straightened up right under the centaur's nose and brought his staff around in a hard swing. It fetched the creature a smart rap on the shoulder, doing no actual harm, but it had to sting severely. The centaur emitted a bellow of sheer, impassioned rage. He whipped his bow around with his left hand, while his right hand dived for the quiver of arrows hanging on his equine shoulder. But now, Bink's staff was tangled in his bow. The creature threw down the bow. The action ripped the staff out of Bink's hands. The centaur made a huge fist. Bink scurried around to the rear as that fist swung at him. But the rear of the centaur was no safer than the front. One leg kicked back violently. Through a freak of timing, it missed Bink and clubbed into the trunk of the needle cactus. The cactus responded with a barrage of flying needles. Even as the hoofs struck, Bink threw himself flat on the ground. The needles overshot him and plunked into the handsome posterior of the centaur. Once more, Bink had lucked out. He was miraculously untouched by either hoof or needles. The centaur neighed with truly amazing volume. Those needles hurt. Each one was 2 inches long and barbed, and 100 of them decorated the glistening surface, tacking the tail to the donkey, as it were. Had the creature been facing the cactus, he could have been blinded or killed as the barbs punctured his face and neck. He was lucky, too, though he hardly seemed to appreciate his fortune at the moment. Now there were no bounds to the centaur's anger. An unholy contortion of utter rage ravaged his homely face. He did a massive prance, his hindquarters rising and descending in an arc, bringing his front part abruptly adjacent to Bink. 2 crushingly powerful arms shot out, and 2 horny hands closed about Bink's relatively puny neck. Slowly they tightened, with vice-like deliberation. Bink, lifted off the ground so that his feet dangled, was helpless. He knew he was about to be strangled. He could not even plead for mercy, for his air and much of his blood were cut off. "Chester!" a female voice cried. The centaur stiffened. This did Bink no good. "Chester, you put that man down this instant," the voice said peremptorily. "Do you want an interspecies incident?" "But Cherie," Chester protested, his color abating several shades. "He's an intruder, and he asked for it." "He's on the king's path," Cherie said. "Travelers are immune to molestation. You know that. Now let him go." The lady centaur hardly seemed to be in a position to enforce her demand, but Chester slowly bowed to her authority. "Can't I just squeeze him a little?" he begged, squeezing a little. Bink's eyeballs almost popped out of their sockets. "If you do, I'll never run with you again. Down." "Aww." Reluctantly, Chester eased off. Bink slid to the ground, reeling. What a fool he had been to tangle with this brute. The female centaur caught him as he swayed. Poor thing, she exclaimed, cushioning his head against a plush pillow. Are you all right? Bing opened his mouth, gagged, and tried again. It seemed that his crushed throat would never unkink. Yes, he croaked. Who are you? What happened to your hand? Did Chester? No, Bink said hastily. He didn't bite off my finger. That's a childhood injury. See, it's long since healed over. She inspected it carefully, running her surprisingly delicate fingers over it. Yes, I see. Still... I am Bink of the North Village, he said. He turned his head to face her and discovered the nature of the pillow he rested against. Oh no, not again, he thought. Will I always be babied by women? Centaur females were smaller than the males, but still stood somewhat taller than human beings. Their humanoid proportions were somewhat better endowed. He jerked his head away from her bare front. It was bad enough being babied by his mother, let alone a lady centaur. I'm traveling south to see the magician Humphrey. Cherie nodded. She was a beautiful creature, both as horse and as human, with glossy flanks and a remarkable human forefigure. Her face was attractive, only very slightly long of nose in the equine manner. Her brown human hair trailed all the way down to her saddle region, balancing her similarly flowing tail. And this ass waylaid you? Well... Bink looked at Chester, again noting the rippling muscle beneath the deadly glower. What would happen when the filly departed? It was a misunderstanding. I'll bet, Cherie said, but Chester relaxed a trifle. Evidently, he did not want to tangle with his girlfriend. Bink could readily appreciate why. If Cherie was not the loveliest and spunkiest centaur of the herd, she was surely close to it. I'll just be moving on now, Bink said. He could have done this at the outset, allowing Chester to run him off in a southerly direction. He had been as much to blame for the altercation as the centaur. Sorry about the problem. He held out his hand to Chester. Chester showed his teeth, which were more like horse's teeth than human ones. He made a big fist. Chester, Cherie snapped. Then, as the centaur guiltily relaxed his fist, what happened to your flank? The male's complexion darkened again, but not precisely with rage this time. He trotted his damaged posterior around to avoid the inquiring gaze of the female. Bink had almost forgotten about the needles. They must still be hurting, and it would hurt more to yank them all out. What a pain in the tail! A most awkward locale to discuss in mixed company. He almost felt sympathy for the surly creature. Chester suppressed his assorted reactions and with fine discipline took Bink's hand. I hope everything comes out all right in the end, Bink said, with a smile that became a bit broader than intended. In fact, he feared it resembled a smirk. and abruptly he knew he shouldn't have chosen those particular words or that particular expression on this particular occasion. Something homicidal reddened the whites of the centaur's eyes. "Quite all right," he gritted through the grinding of clenched teeth. His hand began to squeeze, but his eyes were not yet so bloodshot as to miss the filly's glare. The fingers relaxed unwillingly. Another close call. Bink could have had his finger bones pulped in that grip. "I'll give you a lift," Shree decided. "Chester, put him on my back." Chester put his hands under Bink's elbows and hoisted him like a feather. For a moment, Bink feared he would be thrown 50 feet, but Cherie's fair eye was still on them, and so he landed safely and gently on the lady's back. "Is that your staff?" she inquired, glancing at the tangled staff and bow. And Chester, without even being directed, lifted the staff and returned it to Bink, who tucked it slantwise between his back and his pack for easy transport. "Put your arms around my waist so you won't fall off when I move," Cherie said. Good advice. Bink was inexperienced at riding, and there was no saddle. Very few honest horses remained in Xanth. Unicorns were very touchy about being mounted, and the winged horses were almost impossible to catch or tame. Once, when Bink was a child, a horsefly had been singed by a dragon, losing its flight feathers, and had had to prostitute itself so far as to give the villagers short rides in exchange for food and protection. The moment it had recovered, it had flown away. That had been Bink's only prior riding experience. He leaned forward. The staff interfered, preventing him from bending his back sufficiently. He reached back to draw it out, and it fell out of his hand to the ground. There was a snort from Chester that sounded suspiciously like humor, but the centaur picked it up and returned it to him. Bing tucked it under his arm this time, leaned forward again, and hugged Cherie's slender waist, heedless of Chester's renewed glower. Some things were worth the risk, such as getting out of here in a hurry. "You go to the vet and get those needles out of your—" Cherie began, speaking over her shoulder to the male. "Right away," Chester interrupted. He waited for her to start, then turned and cantered off in the direction he had come from, a little awkwardly. Probably each motion inflamed his hindquarters more. Cherie trotted down the path. "Chester is really a good creature at heart," she said apologetically, "but he does tend to be a bit arrogant, and he gets his tail all knotted up when balked. We've had some trouble with outlaws recently, and—" "Human outlaws?" Bink asked. "Yes, kids from the north, doing mischief magic, gassing our livestock, shooting swords into trees, making dangerous pits seem to appear under our feet, that sort of thing. So, naturally, Chester assumed—" "I know the culprits," Bink said. "I had a scrape with them myself. They've been grounded now. I had known they were coming down here." "There just doesn't seem to be much discipline on the range these days," she said. "According to the Covenant, your king is supposed to keep order, but recently—" "Our king is getting old," Bink explained. "He's losing his power, And there's a lot of trouble cropping up. He used to be a major magician, storm brewer. We know, she agreed. When the fireflies infested our oat fields, he generated a storm that rained 5 days and drowned them all out. Of course, it also ruined our crops, but the flies were doing that anyway. Every day, new fires. At least we were able to replant without further molestation. We're not forgetting the help he rendered, so we don't want to make an issue of it. But I don't know how much longer stallions like Chester are going to put up with these annoyances. That's why I wanted to talk with you. Maybe when you go home, if you could call things to the attention of the king. I don't think that would work. I'm sure the king wants to keep order. He just doesn't have the power anymore. Then perhaps it is time for a new king. He's getting senile. That means he hasn't got the sense to step down. And won't admit there's any problem. Yes, but problems don't go away by being ignored. She made a delicate feminine snort. Something has to be done. Maybe I can get some advice from Magician Humphrey, Bink said. It's a serious business, deposing a king. I don't think the elders would go for it. He did do good work in his prime, and there's really nobody to replace him. You know that only a great magician can be king. Yes, of course. We centaurs are all scholars, you know. Sorry, I forgot. Our village school is run by a centaur. I just wasn't thinking of that. In the wilderness. Understandable. Though I'd call this range, not wilderness. I specialize in humanoid history, and Chester studies horsepower applications. Others are legal scholars, experts in natural sciences, philosophers. She broke off. Now, hang on. There's a trench up ahead I've got to hurdle. Bink had been relaxing, but now he leaned forward again and clasped his hands tightly around her waist. She had a sleek, comfortable back, but it was too easy to slide off. However, if she weren't a centaur, he would never have had the nerve to assume such a position. Cherie picked up speed, galloping down the hill, and the motion made him bounce alarmingly. Peering ahead under her arm, he saw the trench. Trench? It was a gorge, some 10 feet across, rushing up at them. Now he was more than alarmed. He was frightened. His hands became sweaty, and he began to slide off the side. Then she leaped with a single mighty spasm of her haunches and sailed up and across. Bink slipped further. He had a glimpse of the stony bottom of the trench. Then they landed. The jolt caused him to slide around even more. His arms scrabbled desperately for a more secure hold, and wandered into distinctly awkward territory. Yet if he let go, Cherie caught him around the waist and set him on the ground. Easy, she said. We made it. Bink blushed. I'm sorry. I started to fall and just grabbed. I know. I felt your weight shift as I leaped. If you had done it on purpose, I'd have dropped you into the trench. And in that instant, she looked uncomfortably like Chester. He believed her. She could drop a man into a trench if she had reason to. Centaurs were tough creatures. Maybe I'd better walk now. No, there's another trench. They've been opening up recently. Well, I could climb down one side and up the other carefully. It would take longer, but no, there are nickelpedes at the bottom. Bink quailed. Nickelpedes were like centipedes, but about 5 times as large and considerably more deadly. Their myriad legs could cling to vertical rock faces, and their pincers could gouge out discs of flesh an inch across. They inhabited shadowed crevices, not liking direct sunlight. Even dragons hesitated to walk through ditches known to be infested by nickelpedes, and for good reason. The cracks have been opening up recently, Cherie continued as she kneeled to permit Bink to mount her again. He picked up his dropped staff and used it to help him climb. I'm afraid there's big magic brewing somewhere, spreading throughout Xanth, causing discord in animal, vegetable, and mineral. I'll get you across that next trench. Then it's beyond Centaur territory. It hadn't occurred to him that there would be such barriers. They didn't show on his map. The trail was supposed to be clear and reasonably safe throughout, but the map had been made years ago, and these cracks in the ground were new, Cherie said. Nothing in Xanth was permanent, and travel was always somewhat risky. He was lucky he had obtained the Lady Centaur's help. The landscape changed, as if the trench separated one type of place from another. Before it had been rolling hills and fields. Now it was forest. The path became narrower, crowded by huge mock pine trees, and the forest floor was a red-brown carpet of mock needles. Here and there were patches of light green ferns, which seemed to thrive where weeds could not, and regions of dark green moss. A cold wind gusted through, tousling Cherie's hair and mane, carrying strands back against Bink. It was quiet here, and there was a pleasant, piney smell. He felt like dismounting and lying down in a bed of moss, just appreciating this peaceful spot. Don't do it, Cherie warned. Bink jumped. I didn't know centaurs practiced magic. Magic? She inquired, and he knew she was frowning. You read my mind. She laughed. Hardly. We do know magic, but we do know the effect these woods have on humans. It's the peace spell the trees make to protect themselves from getting chopped. Nothing wrong in that, Bink said. Wasn't going to chop them anyway. They don't trust in your good intentions. I'll show you. She stepped carefully off the beaten trail, her hooves sinking into the soft pine needle floor. She threaded her way between several dagger-spoked buck spruce trees, past a thin snake palm which didn't even bother to hiss at her, and stopped near a tangle willow. Not too near. Everyone knew better than that. There, she murmured. Bink looked where her hand pointed. A human skeleton lay on the ground. Murder? He asked, shivering. No, just sleep. He came to rest here, as you wished to do just now, and never got up the gumption to depart. Complete peace is an insidious thing. Yes, he breathed. No violence, no distress, just loss of initiative. Why bother to work and eat when it was so much easier merely to relax? If a person wanted to commit suicide, this would be the ideal manner. But he had reason to live, so far. That's part of why I like Chester. He'll never succumb to anything like this. That was a certainty. There was no peace in Chester. Shuri herself would never succumb, Fink thought, though she was considerably more gentle. Fink felt the lassitude, despite the sight of the skeleton, but she was evidently able to resist the spell. Maybe the biology of the centaurs differed enough, or maybe she had savagery in her soul that her angelic form and pleasant words masked. Most likely, a bit of both. Let's get out of here. She laughed. Don't worry, I'll see you safely through it. But don't come back this way alone. Travel with an enemy, if you can find one. That's best. Better than a friend? Friends are peaceful, she explained. Oh, that did make sense. He'd never relax under a pine tree if he were with someone like Jama. He'd be too afraid of getting a sword in his gut. But what an ironic necessity to locate an enemy to accompany one to walk through a peaceful forest. Magic makes strange companions, he murmured. This peace spell also explained why there was so little other magic here. The plants did not need individual defensive spells. No one was going to attack. Even the tangle tree had seemed quiescent, though he was sure it would make a grab when it had the chance, since that was the way it fed. Interesting how quickly magic faded when the immediate imperative of survival abated. No, there was magic, strong magic. It was the communal magic of the entire forest, with each plant contributing its modicum. If a person could figure out a way to nullify the effect in himself, perhaps with a counter charm, he could live here in absolute safety. That was worth remembering. They threaded their way back to the path and resumed travel. Bink almost slid off his perch twice, falling asleep, each time awakening with a shock. He would never have made it out of here alone. He was glad to see the pine forest thin, shifting into hardwoods. He felt more alert, more violent, and that was good. Harder wood, harder feelings. I wonder who that was back there, Bink mused. Oh, I know, Shuri answered. He was one of the last wave who got lost, wandered in here, and decided to rest. Forever. But the last wavers were savage, Bink said. They slaughtered indiscriminately. All waves were savage. When they came, with one exception, she said. We centaurs know. We were here before the first wave. We had to fight all of you, until the Covenant. You didn't have magic, but you had weapons and numbers and vicious cunning. Many of us died. My ancestors were first wave, Bink said with a certain pride. We always had magic, and we never fought the centaurs. Now, don't get aggressive, human, just because I took you out of the peace pines, she cautioned. You do not have our knowledge of history. Bink realized that he'd better moderate his tone if he wanted to continue the ride. And he did want to continue. Cherie was pleasant company, and she obviously knew all the local magic, so that she was able to avoid all threats. Last and most, she was giving his tired legs a good rest while bearing him forward rapidly. Already she had taken him a good 10 miles. I'm sorry. It was a matter of family pride. Well, that's no bad thing, she said, mollified. She made her way delicately across a wooden trestle over a bubbling brook. Suddenly, Bink was thirsty. May we stop for a drink? He asked. She snorted again, a very horse-like sound. Not here. Anyone who drinks from that water becomes a fish. A fish? Suddenly, Bink was twice as glad to have this guide. He surely would have drunk otherwise. Unless she was merely telling him that to tease him, or trying to scare him away from this area. Why? The river is trying to restock itself. It was cleaned out by the evil magician Trent 21 years ago. Fink remained a bit skeptical about inanimate magic, especially of that potency. How could a river desire anything? Still, he remembered how Lookout Rock had saved itself from being broken up. Better to play it safe and assume that some features of the landscape could cast spells. Meanwhile, the reference to Trent preempted his attention. The evil magician was here? I thought he was a phenomenon of our own village. Trent was everywhere, she said. He wanted us centaurs to support him, and when we balked, because of the covenant, you know, not to interfere in human business, he showed us his power by changing every fish in this river into a lightning bug. Then he departed. I think he figured that those shocking buggers would force us to change our minds. Why didn't he change the fish into a human army and try to conquer you that way? No good, Bink. They might have had the bodies of men, but their minds would have remained fish. They would have made very wishy-washy soldiers. And even if they had been good soldiers, they would hardly have served the man who had put them under that enchantment. They would have attacked Trent. Yes. I wasn't thinking. So we transformed them into lightning bugs and got well away from there so they couldn't shock him. So they went for the next best thing. Yes, it was a very bad time for us. Oh, those bugs were a pain. They pestered us in clouds, scorching us with their little lightning bolts. I've still got scars on my... She paused, grimacing. On my tail. It was obviously a euphemism. What did you do? Bink inquired, fascinated, glancing back to see whether he could locate the scars. What he could see seemed flawless. Trent was exiled soon after that, and we got Humphrey to abate the spell. But the good magician isn't a transformer. No, but he told us where to find repellent magic to drive off the flies. Denied our electro-cooked flesh, the scourge soon died out. Good information is as good action, and the good magician certainly had the information. That's why I'm going to him, Bink agreed. But he charges a year's service for a spell. You're telling us. 300 head of centaur, 1 year each. What a job! All of you had to pay? What did you have to do? We are not permitted to tell, she said diffidently. Now, Bink was doubly curious, but he knew better than to ask again. A centaur's given word was inviolate. But what could Humphrey have needed done that he could not do himself via one of his 100 spells? Or at least by means of his good information? Humphrey was basically a divinator. Anything he didn't know, he could find out. And that gave him enormous power. Probably the reason the village elders had not asked the good magician what to do about their senile king was that they knew what he would answer. Depose the king and install a new, young, fresh magician instead. That they obviously weren't ready to do, even if they could find such a young magician to serve. Well, there were many mysteries and many problems in Xanth, and it was hardly given to Bink to know of them all, or to solve any. He had learned long ago to bow, however ungraciously, to the inevitable. They were past the river now, and climbing. The trees were closing in more thickly, their great round roots ridging across the path. No hostile magic threatened. Either the centaurs had cleaned out the area, the way the villagers had cleaned out Bink's home region, or Cherie knew this path so well that she avoided spells automatically, without seeming to. Probably some of both. Life itself, he thought, involved many alternate explanations for perplexing questions, and was generally some of both. Few things were hard and fast in Xanth. What was that history you know that I don't? Bink inquired, becoming bored by the trail. About the waves of human colonization? We have records of them all. Since the Shield and the Covenant, things have quieted down. The waves were terrors. Not the first wavers, Bink said loyally. We were peaceful. That's what I mean. You are peaceful now, except for a few of your young hoodlums. So you assume your ancestors were peaceful then. But my ancestors found it otherwise. They would have been happier had man never discovered Xanth. My teacher was a centaur, Bink said. He never said anything about. He'd have been fired if he had told you the truth. Bink felt uneasy. You're not teasing me, are you? I'm not looking for any trouble. I have a very curious mind, but I've already had more trouble than I care for. She turned her head around to fix him with a gentle stare. Her torso twisted from the human waist to facilitate the motion. The torque was impressive. Her midsection was more limber than that of a human girl, perhaps because it was harder for a centaur to turn her whole body around. But if she had a human lower section to match the upper section, what a creature she would be. Your teacher didn't lie to you. A centaur never lies. He merely edited his information, on orders from the king, so as not to force on the impressionable minds of children things their parents did not want them to hear. Education has ever been thus. Oh, I wasn't implying any slight on his integrity, Bink said quickly. I liked him. As a matter of fact, he was the only one who didn't get fed up with all my questions. I learned a lot from him, but I guess I didn't ask about history much. I was more preoccupied with something he couldn't tell me. But at least he did tell me about the magician Humphrey. What is your question for Humphrey, if I may ask? What difference did it make? I have no magic, he confessed. At least, I seem to have none. All through my childhood, I was at a disadvantage because I couldn't use magic to compete. I could run faster than anybody else, but the kid who could levitate still won the race. Stuff like that. Centaurs get along perfectly well without magic, she pointed out. We wouldn't take magic if it were offered. Bink did not believe that, but did not want to make an issue of it. Humans have a different attitude, I guess. When I got older, it got worse. Now, I will be exiled if I don't show some magic talent. I'm hoping Magician Humphrey can. Well, if I do have magic, it means I can stay and marry my girl and have some pride. Finally. Cherie nodded. I suspected it was something like that. I suppose if I were in your situation, I could choke down the necessity of having magic, though I really think your culture's values are distorted. You should base your citizenship on superior qualities of personality and achievement, not on... Exactly, Bink agreed fervently. She smiled. You really should have been a centaur. She shook her head so that her hair flung out prettily. You have undertaken a hazardous journey. Not more hazardous than the one to the mundane world that will otherwise be forced on me. She nodded again. Very well. You have satisfied my curiosity. I'll satisfy yours. I'll tell you the whole truth about the human intrusion into Xanth. But I don't expect you to like it much. I don't expect to like the truth about myself much, Bink said ruefully. I might as well know whatever there is to know. For thousands of years, Xanth was a comparatively peaceful land, she said, assuming the somewhat pedantic tone he remembered from his school days. Probably every centaur was at heart a teacher. There was magic, very strong magic, but no unnecessary viciousness. We centaurs were the dominant species, but, as you know, we have absolutely no magic. We are magic. I suppose we migrated here from Mundania originally, but that was so long ago it is lost even to our records. Something tripped over in Bink's mind. I wonder if that really is true, about magic creatures not being able to work spells. I saw a chip mouse conjure a crumb of bread. Oh, are you sure it wasn't a chipmunk? That is a natural creature, according to our taxonomy, so it might work magic. You tax animals? Bink asked, amazed. Taxonomy, she repeated with an indulgent smile. The classification of living things. Another centaur speciality. Oh, Bink considered, embarrassed. I thought it was a chip mouse, but I'm not quite certain now. Actually, we're not quite certain either, she admitted. It may be that some magical creatures can work magic, but as a general rule, a creature either does magic or is magic, not both, which is just as well. Think of the havoc a dragon magician could make. Fink thought of it. He shuddered. Let's get back to the history lesson, he suggested. About 1,000 years ago, the first human tribe discovered Xanth. They thought it was just another peninsula. They moved in and cut down the trees and slaughtered the animals. There was more than enough magic here to repulse them, but Xanth had never been subjected to such callous, systematic ravage before, and we did not quite believe it. We thought the humans would leave soon. But then they realized that Xanth was magic. They saw the animals levitating and the trees moving their branches. They hunted the unicorns and griffins. If you wonder why those big animals hate people, let me assure you, they have good reason. Their ancestors would not have survived if they'd tried to be friendly. The first Wavers were non-magical creatures in a land of spells, and after they got over the initial shock, they liked it. Now that's wrong, Bink exclaimed. Humans have the strongest magic. Look at all the great magicians. You yourself told me just now how evil magician Trent changed all the fish. Pipe down before I buck you off, Cherie snapped. Her tail swished menacingly past Bink's ear. You don't know the quarter of it. Of course humans have magic now. That's part of their problem, but not at the start. Bink backed down again. It was increasingly easy to do. He liked this centaur lady very well. She was answering questions he hadn't even thought to ask yet. Sorry, this is new to me. You remind me of Chester. I'll bet you're awfully stubborn, too. Yeah, Bink said contritely. She laughed, and it sounded a bit like neighing. I do like you, human. I hope you find your... She pursed her lips distastefully. Magic. Then she flashed a sunny smile and as quickly sobered. Those first Wavers had no magic, and when they found out what magic could do, they were fascinated, but a bit afraid of it. A number of them perished in a lake that had a drown spell, and some ran afoul of dragons. And when they met the first basilisk... Are there still basilisks? Bink inquired worriedly, abruptly remembering the omen of the chameleon. It had stared at him in the guise of a basilisk just before it died, as if its spell had backfired. He had yet to be sure of the meaning of that sequence. Yes, there are, but not many, she answered. Both humans and centaurs labored to stamp them out. Their glance is fatal to us too, you know. Now they hide, because they know that the first intelligent creature killed that way will bring an avenging army of mirror-masked warriors down on them. A basilisk is no match for a forewarned man or centaur. It's just a small winged lizard, you know, with the head and claws of a chicken. Not very intelligent. Not that it usually needs to be. Say, Bink exclaimed. Maybe that's the missing factor. Intelligence. A creature can do magic, or be magic, or be smart, or any two of the three, but never all three. So a chipmouse might conjure, but not a smart dragon. She turned her head about again to face him. That's a novel idea. You're pretty smart yourself. I'll have to think about it. But until we verify it, don't go into the central wilderness unprotected. There just might be a smart spell-throwing monster in there. I won't go into the wilderness, Bing promised. At least, I won't stray from the cleared path through it until I get to the magician's castle. I don't want any lizards looking death at me. Your ancestors were more aggressive, Cherie remarked. That's why so many of them died. But they conquered Xanth and formed an enclave where magic was banned. They liked the country and the uses of magic, you see, but they didn't want it too close to home. So they burned the forest there, killed all magical animals and plants, and built a great stone wall. The ruins! Bink exclaimed. I thought those old stones were from an enemy camp. They are from the first wave, she insisted. But I am descended from. I said you wouldn't like this. I don't, he agreed. But I want to hear it. How can my ancestors have? They settled in their walled village and planted mundane crops and herded mundane cattle. You know, beans and wingless cows. They married the women they had brought along, or that they could raid from the closest mundane settlements, and had children. Xanth was a good land, even in that region expunged of magic. But then, something amazing happened. Cherie turned to face him again, glancing obliquely in a manner that would have been most fetching in a human girl. In fact, it was fetching in a centaur girl, especially if he squinted so as to see only her human portion. Splendidly fetching, despite his knowledge that centaurs lived longer than humans, so that she was probably 50 years old. She looked 20. 20 that few humans ever achieved. No halter would hold this filly. What happened? He asked, catering to her evident desire for an intellectual response. Centaurs were good storytellers, and they did like a good audience. Their children came up magic, she said. Aha! So the first waivers were magic. No, they were not. The land of Xanth is magic. It's an environmental effect, but it works much better with children, who are more formative, and it works best with babies conceived and birthed here. Adults, even of long residence, tend to suppress the talents they have because they know better. But children accept what is. So not only do they have more natural talent, they use it with more enthusiasm. I never knew that, he said. My folks have much more magic than I do. Some of my ancestors were magicians, but me? He sobered. I'm afraid I was a terrible disappointment to my parents. By rights, I should have had very strong magic, maybe even been a magician myself. Instead, Cherie discreetly did not comment. At first, the humans were shocked, but soon they accepted it and even encouraged the development of special talents. One of the youngsters had the ability to transform lead into gold. They ravaged the hills searching for lead, and finally had to send a mission to obtain it from Mundania. It was almost as if lead had become more valuable than gold. But Xanth has no dealings with the mundane world. You keep forgetting. This is ancient history. Sorry again. Wouldn't interrupt so much if I weren't so interested. You are an excellent audience, she said, and he felt pleased. Most humans would refuse to listen at all, because it is not a complimentary history, not to your kind. I'd probably be less open-minded if I didn't face exile myself, he admitted. But all I have to work with is my brain and body, so I better not fool myself. A commendable philosophy. You are, incidentally, getting a longer ride than I planned, because you pay such good, responsive attention. At any rate, they got the let out, but paid a hideous price. Because the mundanes of Mundania learned about the magic. They were true to their type, greedy and rapacious. The notion of cheap gold sent them into a frenzy. They invaded, stormed the wall, and killed all the first wave men and children. But, Bink protested, horrified, those were the second wavers. Cherie said gently, they saved the first waver women, you see, because the second wave was an all-male army. They thought there was a machine to convert the lead into gold, or an alchemical process organized by a secret formula. They didn't really believe in magic. That was just a convenient term to describe the unknown. So they didn't realize that the lead was converted into gold by the magic of a child, until too late. They had destroyed what they had come for. Horrible, Bink said. You mean I am descended from the rape of a first-wave mother? Yes. There is no other way you can authenticate your lineage. We centaurs had never liked the first wavers, but we were sorry for them then. The second wavers were worse. They were literal pirates, rapacious. Had we known, we would have helped the first wavers fight them off. Our archers could have ambushed them. She shrugged. Centaur archery was legendary. No need to belabor the point. Now the invaders settled, she continued after a pause. They sent their own archers all over Xanth, killing. She broke off, and Bink knew how keenly she felt the irony of her kind being prey to the inferior archery of human beings. She gave a little shudder that almost dislodged him, and forced herself to continue. Killing centaurs for meat. Not until we organized and ambushed their camp, putting shafts through half of them, did they agree to let us alone. Even after that, they did not honor their agreement very well, for they had precious little sense of honor. And their children had magic, Fink continued, seeing it now. And so the third wavers invaded, and killed off the second wavers. Yes, this happened after several generations, though it was every bit as vicious when it came. The second wavers had become tolerably good neighbors, all things considered, by then. Again, only the women were saved, and not many of them. Because they had been in Xanth all their lives, their magic was strong. They used it to eliminate their rapist husbands one by one in ways that could not be traced to the women. But their victory was their defeat, for now they had no families at all. So they had to invite in more mundanes. This is ghastly, Fink said. I am descended from 1,000 years of ignominy. Not entirely. The history of man in Xanth is brutal, but not without redeeming values, even greatness. The second wave women organized and brought in only the finest men they could locate. Strong, just, kind, intelligent men who understood the background but came more from principle than from greed. They promised to keep the secret and to uphold the values of Xanth. They were mundanes, but they were noble ones. The fourth wavers, Fink exclaimed. The finest of them all. Yes. The Xanth women were widows and victims of rape, and finally, murderesses. Some were old or scarred physically and emotionally by the campaign, but they all had strong magic and iron determination. They were the survivors of the cruel upheaval that had wiped out all other humans in Xanth. These qualities were quite evident. When the new men learned the whole truth, some turned about and returned to Mundania. But others liked marrying witches. They wanted to have children with potent magic, and they thought it might be hereditary. So they regarded youth and beauty as secondary. They made excellent husbands. Others wanted the potentials of the unique land of Xanth developed and protected. They were the environmentalists, and magic was the most precious part of the environment. Not all the fourth wavers were men. Some were carefully selected young women, brought in to marry the children, so that there would not be too much inbreeding. So it was a settlement, not an invasion, and it was not rooted in murder, but based on sound commercial and biological principles. I know, Fink said. That was the wave of the first great magicians. So it was. Of course, there were other waves, but none so critical. The effective dominance of human beings in Xanth dates back from that fourth wave. Other invasions killed many and drove more into the backwoods, but the continuity was never broken. Just about every truly intelligent or magical person traces his ancestry to the fourth wave. I'm sure you do too. Yes, Fink agreed. I have ancestors from the first 6 waves. I always thought the first wave lineage was the most important. The institution of the magic shield finally stopped the waves. It kept all mundane creatures out and all Xanth creatures in. It was hailed as the salvation of Xanth, the guarantor of utopia. But somehow, things didn't improve much. It is as if the people exchanged one problem for another, a visible threat for an invisible one. In the past century, Xanth has been entirely free from invasion, but other threats have developed. Like the Fireflies and the Wiggles and Bad Magician Trent? Fink agreed. Magical hazards. Trent was not a bad magician, Shuri corrected him. He was an evil magician. There's a distinction, a crucial one. Yes. He was a good, evil magician. Luckily, they got rid of him before he took over Xanth. Certainly. But suppose another evil magician appears, or the Wiggles manifest again. Who will save Xanth this time? I don't know, Fink admitted. Sometimes I wonder whether the shield was really a good idea. It has the net effect of intensifying the magic in Xanth, preventing dilution from outside, as if that magic were building up toward an explosion point. Yet I certainly wouldn't want to return to the days of the waves. Fink had never thought of it that way. Somehow, I find it hard to appreciate the problems of the concentration of magic in Xanth, he said. I keep wishing there were just a little more. Enough for me, for my talent. You might be better off without it, she suggested. If you could just obtain a dispensation from the king. Ha! Bink said. I'd be better off living like a hermit in the wilderness. My village won't tolerate a man without a talent. Strange inversion, she murmured. What? Oh, nothing. I was just thinking of Herman the Hermit. He was exiled from our herd some years back for obscenity. Bink laughed. What could be obscene to a centaur? What did he do? Cherie drew up abruptly at the edge of a pretty field of flowers. This is as far as I go, she said tersely. Bink realized that he had said the wrong thing. I didn't mean to offend. I apologize for whatever. Cherie relaxed. You couldn't know. The odor of these flowers makes centaurs do crazy things. I have to stay clear except in real emergencies. I believe Magician Humphrey's castle is about 5 miles south. Keep alert for hostile magic, and I hope you find your talent. Thanks, Bink said gratefully. He slid off her back. His legs were a bit stiff from the long ride, but he knew she had gained him a day's travel time. He walked around to face her and held out his hand. Cherie accepted it, then leaned forward to kiss him. A motherly kiss. On his forehead. Bink wished she had not done that, but he smiled mechanically and started walking. He heard her hooves cantering back through the forest, and suddenly he felt lonely. Fortunately, his journey was nearly over. But he still wondered. What had Herman the Hermit done that the centaurs considered obscene? All right, guys, that is the end of Chapter 2, and I think that's where we'll go ahead and call it for the evening. But hey, 2 chapters! Woo! Yay! Ha! So, Jeff, if you are still out there, so the Nickelpedes, yes, so basically they chop out of, with their pincers, they bite out of whatever substance that they're biting out of about a nickel size of flesh, which is about an inch. Which is why they're called Nickelpedes. Xanth. Gotta love it, man. So I hope you guys enjoyed, the first couple of chapters of A Spell for Chameleon, the first Xanth novel. I'll have the recordings of these put up onto my YouTube channel a little bit later this evening, so that way if you missed them, you may most certainly get them checked out, and I hope you do. As always, give them a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel if you have not done so already, always appreciated. We will not be having our VTT game tomorrow night. It is my understanding that Chuck is still out and traveling, so we will not be able to have our VTT game. Uh, I will verify because there's a chance we're having it, but I don't think so. I believe he's not back. And so if that's the case, we'll figure out something fun to do tomorrow. It may just be a little bit different than normal, and that is okay. Different than normal is okay. But thank you guys all so much. The greatest gift that you can give to a streamer is a gift of your time. And I appreciate that you guys gave me the gift of yours this evening, whether it was for 5 minutes or for 3 hours. Whichever way, thanks so much for coming along to spend some time with me this evening. Hope to see you guys all a little bit later this week. And until then, hope you guys have a wonderful evening and a fantastic Wednesday. Good night, everybody.